Captain Chun Byung-in scans his navigation display as Korean Airlines Flight 007 crosses the Alaska coast at 33,000 feet. 3 green INS computers agree on the track to Seoul. Fuel is good, and the autopilot is doing exactly what it has been told to do. Which is the problem? The instruments show every waypoint approaching on schedule, needle-centered, course perfect. But the autopilot is not following the computers at all. It is holding a straight magnetic heading into the night, ignoring the programmed route, and there is no warning light, no alarm, no voice to tell the crew they are already drifting off course. In 40 minutes, they will be 12 miles north of their airway. In 5 hours, they will be 300 miles inside Soviet airspace. Earlier that morning, Captain Chun and First Officer Sun Dong-hui departed Anchorage at 400 local on a polar Great Circle route to Seoul. The flight plan called for 5.5 hours over the Pacific in the Kamchatka Peninsula, threading a narrow corridor between Soviet-restricted zones. The 747-200 was a proven long-haul workhorse, and this crew had flown the route before. Weather was clear, the aircraft was light on fuel after a short positioning leg from New York, and the departure was routine. The Boeing 747-200 carries 3 independent inertial navigation systems, gyroscopes and accelerometers mounted in the belly that dead reckon position without any outside reference. Before departure, the crew programs each INS with a sequence of latitude and longitude waypoints. The systems do not talk to GPS satellites because civilian GPS does not yet exist. They do not check ground radar because there are no beacons over the Pacific. They measure every turn, every acceleration, and calculate where the aircraft should be. If all 3 agree, the crew trusts them completely. INS navigation requires one critical step after takeoff. The crew must switch the autopilot mode selector from HDG, heading hold, to INS within minutes of departure. The selector is a mechanical rotary switch on the glare shield, no bigger than a light knob. It has no interlock, no warning light, and no voice alert. If the crew forgets, or if the switch is left one detent short, the autopilot will ignore the INS computers and hold the departure magnetic heading indefinitely. 40 minutes after departure, KAL 007 is 6 nautical miles north of its filed airway. By the time it leaves Anchorage radar coverage, the deviation is 12 miles and growing. U.S. controllers see the drift on their scopes but have no direct radio link to aircraft this far offshore. Correcting the error requires the crew to notice it first, and they have no reason to look. The INS displays show green needles centered, every waypoint scrolling past on schedule. The INS computers assume the aircraft is following their commands because they have no GPS or radar cross-check. They calculate a perfect track from waypoint to waypoint, dead reckoning every mile, and they display that imaginary route on the cockpit screens. The crew sees what the computers believe, not where the aircraft actually is. The autopilot, meanwhile, is flying a straight magnetic heading into the night, ignoring the INS entirely. The systems are not talking to each other. The crew sees green needles centered, fuel burn on plan, and a smooth ride at flight level 330. Every instrument tells them they are on course. There is no turbulence, no ATC query, no navigation alarm. The 747 is doing exactly what a 747 on a polar route is supposed to do: fly straight, burn fuel efficiently, and keep the passengers asleep. The error is invisible because the error is not in the aircraft. It is in the gap between what the crew intended and what the autopilot understood. Soviet ground radar at Petropavlovsk picks up an unidentified target crossing into restricted airspace over the Kamchatka Peninsula at 0500 Zulu. The blip has no IFF transponder data and no civilian flight plan correlation. The radar operators have no way to tell a 747 from an RC-135 reconnaissance jet at this range, and an RC-135 flew a similar profile earlier that night, probing Soviet air defenses. The standing order is clear. Unidentified intruders will be intercepted. KAL 007's civilian Mode A and Mode C transponder is invisible to Soviet military IFF interrogators. The aircraft looks identical on radar to a US RC-135 reconnaissance jet. Same size, same altitude, same speed. The Soviets have no database of civilian flight plans over the Pacific, and the 747 is transmitting no distress signal, no radio call, no indication it knows where it is. From the ground, it is an intruder that refuses to identify itself. US radar sites in Alaska see the deviation clearly, but they have no real-time radio link to civilian aircraft over the Pacific. Correcting course requires the crew to notice the error first, and KAL-007 is now beyond VHF range of Anchorage Center. The Air Force tracks the 747 drifting north, but there is no procedure to warn a civilian airliner that it is about to enter Soviet airspace. The Cold War has divided the radio spectrum as cleanly as it has divided the map. The 747's INS has no satellite cross-check, no ground-based DME update, and no terrain database this far offshore. Every navigation aid assumes the crew set up the system correctly at departure. There are no VOR beacons over the Bering Sea, no ADS stations over Kamchatka, and no radar altimeter warning because the aircraft is at 33,000 feet over water. Dead reckoning is mandatory, and dead reckoning is only as good as the initial setup. Soviet air defense doctrine allows only minutes to identify, warn, and engage an intruder before it overflies ICBM submarine pens and strategic bomber bases on Kamchatka. The target is inbound at 500 knots, and the restricted zone is less than 200 miles wide. If interceptors do not scramble immediately, the intruder will cross the peninsula and escape back over international waters. Ground control orders fighters airborne from Petropavlovsk. Captain Chun has no indication of airspace violation. There's no radio challenge, no navigation alarm, no ATC query. The INS displays still show the flight on course to Seoul, passing waypoint after waypoint on schedule. The autopilot is flying smoothly, the fuel burn matches the flight plan, and the only sound in the cockpit is the hum of pressurization and the occasional click of a switch. 90 minutes into Soviet airspace, the crew believes they are over international waters. By the time the flight crosses back out over the Sea of Okhotsk toward Sakhalin Island, it has been in Soviet airspace for 90 minutes. Ground radar has tracked it the entire way, and Soviet Air Defense Command has scrambled interceptors from 2 bases. The 747 is now heading directly towards Sakhalin, home to strategic bomber fields and the Pacific Fleet headquarters. This is the last line. If the intruder is not stopped here, it will overfly the most sensitive military installations in the Soviet Far East. Major Gennady Osipovich intercepts the target at 18,000 meters in his Su-15 TM, with fewer than 10 minutes of fuel remaining before mandatory return to base. He has climbed at full afterburner and burned through his reserves, chasing the intruder across the Sea of Okhotsk. Ground control orders him to identify, warn, and destroy if the intruder does not comply. He has 1 pass, maybe 2, before he must break off or risk flaming out over the water. Ground control orders Osipovich to identify, warn, and destroy if the target does not comply. His air-to-air radio calls go out on Soviet Military Guard frequency 121.5 MHz. He transmits in Russian, then in English, ordering the intruder to follow him to a Soviet airfield. There is no response. KAL-007 is tuned to Tokyo area control on a different frequency and hears nothing. The 2 aircraft are less than a mile apart, but they are speaking on separate channels, and neither knows the other is trying to communicate. Osipovich closes to visual range in darkness and sees a large 4-engine silhouette against the stars. The target's anti-collision strobes are off, common practice in crews to avoid blinding the crew, so there are no flashing lights to mark it as civilian. He sees only a dark shape with 4 turbofan exhausts. He cannot read the fuselage markings at night, and he has no IFF return. Ground control is demanding identification, and his fuel gauge is dropping toward the red line. Osipovich fires warning cannon bursts with tracer rounds. The Su-15's twin 23mm cannon eject a stream of phosphorus tracers designed to be visible for miles. But the 747 crew, seated high in the nose and looking forward, cannot see tracers passing behind and below the tail. The rounds arc away into the night, and there is no reaction from the target. It continues straight and level, neither turning nor acknowledging. Ground control orders weapons free. Osipovich locks his Vimpel R-98 infrared missiles on the heat signature of the 747's turbofans. The R-98 is a beam-riding missile with an infrared seeker head that homes on engine exhaust. He has 2 missiles loaded, and at this range, 8 kilometers, both should guide. The target is still flying straight, no evasive maneuvers, no countermeasures. At 0526 Zulu, he receives final clearance and presses the trigger. Both missiles launch within 2 seconds. The missiles guide on engine exhaust and detonate in the left wing fuel tank and aft fuselage. The warheads are designed to destroy bombers, carrying fragmentation sleeves that shred aluminum and sever hydraulic lines. The 747's cabin pressure fails instantly. Passengers are exposed to -50-degree air at 33,000 feet. The left wing is losing fuel, and 2 of the 4 engines have taken shrapnel. The crew feels the impact as a shudder and a yaw to the left. Captain Chun attempts an emergency turn back toward neutral airspace. The 747 begins a slow, spiral descent. Hydraulic pressure is failing in 2 of the 3 systems, and the crew is fighting asymmetric thrust with rudder and aileron trim. The autopilot has disconnected. The descent rate is 1,500 feet per minute, then 3,000, then uncontrolled. The crew transmits no mayday because they are still tuned to Tokyo, and Tokyo is beyond radio range. 12 minutes after impact, the aircraft strikes the Sea of Japan at high speed. There are no survivors among 269 passengers and crew. An inertial navigation system measures acceleration in 3 axes using gyroscopes and accelerometers, then double integrates to calculate velocity and position. No external reference is required. The gyroscopes hold a stable platform in space, and the accelerometers detect every change in speed or direction. The system is self-contained, immune to jamming, and accurate to within a few miles over a trans-Pacific flight. But it has one absolute requirement. It must know where it started. Once initialized with a known latitude and longitude, the INS assumes every movement is intentional and updates position accordingly. It cannot know whether the autopilot is following its steering commands or ignoring them. The system calculates where the aircraft should be if the autopilot were obeying, and it displays that calculated position as truth. If the autopilot is flying a different path, the INS has no sensor to detect the disagreement. It is deaf and blind to the outside world, trusting only its own internal memory of acceleration. The autopilot mode selector on the 747-200 is a mechanical rotary switch with positions for HDG, heading hold, VOR/LOC for radio navigation, and INS for inertial. Switching to INS tells the autopilot to follow the computed track from the INS computers. But the switch has no interlock and no feedback to the INS. If the crew forgets to move it from HDG to INS, the autopilot holds the departure heading as a constant magnetic bearing, while the INS computers continue calculating an imaginary track. The 2 systems never speak. The autopilot does not tell the INS it is being ignored, and the INS does not query the autopilot for confirmation. If the crew forgets to switch from HDG to INS, or if the switch stops 1 detent short, the autopilot holds the departure heading indefinitely. The INS computers, unaware they are being ignored, calculate position as if the aircraft were turning at every waypoint and flying the programmed route. The displays show waypoints approaching and passing on schedule, because the INS believes it is steering the aircraft. Over 5 hours, a 10-degree heading error accumulates into a lateral deviation of 300 nautical miles. The INS continues to show the flight on course because it is calculating an imaginary journey that the autopilot never flew. The crew's only clue would be a gross position check against a ground-based VOR or ADF station. But there are no navigation beacons over the Bering Sea or Kamchatka Peninsula. Dead reckoning is mandatory in this part of the world, And dead reckoning relies entirely on the INS being set up correctly at departure. There is no GPS, no DME range update, no radar altimeter terrain database. The only truth is what the gyroscopes remember. And if the initialization was correct, but the autopilot ignored the steering, the gyroscopes will tell a perfect lie. The result is a silent, ever-growing deviation with perfect instrument indications. The crew is flying a straight line to nowhere, and every gauge confirms they are on course. The autopilot is doing exactly what it was told: hold the departure heading. The INS is doing exactly what it was told: calculate the route. Neither system has failed. There is no malfunction, no broken wire, no stuck valve. The error is in the gap between human intent and machine instruction, and that gap has no warning light. National Security Advisor William Clark receives SIGINT transcripts of the Soviet intercept within hours. U.S. listening posts in Japan recorded Osipovich's radio calls and ground control orders in real time, capturing every transmission on Soviet military frequencies. The intercepts prove the Soviets knew they were engaging a large, slow-moving aircraft and fired without positive identification. But releasing the evidence will reveal exact frequency coverage, recording quality, and geographic reach of U.S. signals intelligence across the Pacific. Reagan demands proof for a UN Security Council presentation within 72 hours. The world is watching, and Soviet denials are already circulating. If the U.S. reveals too much, the Soviets will change their radio procedures and encrypted call signs, and years of signal intelligence collection will vanish overnight. If the U.S. reveals too little, the propaganda victory goes to Moscow, and the world believes the intrusion was a deliberate spy mission. Clark has 3 days to decide how much truth is worth the cost. Clark authorizes limited release of the audio, with frequency and location data redacted. Each detail disclosed permanently burns intelligence sources. If the Soviets learn which frequencies were monitored, they change call signs. If they learn the geographic precision, they move transmitters. The UN presentation includes Osipovich's voice saying the target is destroyed, translated from Russian, with background hiss that hints at the distance and quality of the intercept, but reveals nothing about the collection method. The Soviets deny the aircraft was civilian and refuse to release the flight recorders. Soviet Navy divers recover both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder from the Sea of Japan within weeks, but Moscow keeps them sealed. Without the black boxes, ICAO investigators cannot definitively prove whether the INS mode selector was an HDG or INS position at departure. Mechanical failure versus pilot error remains unresolved, and the Cold War propaganda war continues unchecked. ICAO investigators reconstruct the navigation error, using only radar tracks and wreckage scatter analysis. They plot the deviation mile by mile, matching it to the INS phantom track phenomenon. The radar data shows a smooth, constant heading with no course corrections, consistent with an autopilot locked in HDG mode. But without the cockpit voice recorder, they cannot hear whether the crew discussed the mode selector or noticed any warning. The report concludes the intrusion was accidental, but the mechanism remains circumstantial. The propaganda stalemate lasts 9 years. In 1992, after the Soviet Union collapses, Russian authorities finally released the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder transcripts. The data confirms the INS deviation and rules out deliberate intrusion. The mode selector position cannot be determined from the recordings, but the autopilot behavior matches HDG mode throughout the flight. The crew's last words are attempts to control the descent after the missile impact. There is no evidence they ever knew they were in Soviet airspace. 2 weeks after the shootdown, President Reagan signs a directive authorizing civilian access to the GPS satellite constellation, previously restricted to U.S. military users. The decision is framed as a humanitarian gesture, but it is also a strategic calculation. If civilian aircraft worldwide can fix their position to within 100 meters using satellite signals, no navigation error like Cal 007's will ever go undetected again. But opening GPS raises a different problem. Every adversary will get free precision guidance for cruise missiles and artillery. The DoD GPS Joint Program Office is ordered to open the system without giving adversaries the precision needed to target U.S. bases. They have only one solution: selective availability, a deliberate dither signal that degrades civilian GPS accuracy to roughly 100 meters. Military receivers use an encrypted PY code signal that bypasses the dither and delivers 10-meter accuracy. Selective availability is not a technical limitation. It is an engineered compromise, a way to make satellite navigation safe for airliners without making it deadly for U.S. forces. The system goes live in 1990. Every civilian GPS receiver in the world gets free position fixes with roughly a 100-meter error. Precise enough for navigation, but too coarse for missile targeting. Airlines retrofit their 747s with GPS cross-check displays that compare INS position to satellite position in real time. If the two disagree by more than a few miles, a warning light illuminates, and the crew knows immediately that one system is wrong. The phantom track problem becomes obsolete the moment GPS provides an independent truth. Selective availability remains active for 17 years. In 2000, President Clinton orders it turned off, giving civilians the same precision the military always had. The decision reflects the end of the Cold War and the rise of commercial GPS applications, from car navigation to precision agriculture. The 100-meter dither disappears overnight, and civilian receivers begin reporting 10-meter accuracy. The compromise that open GPS is no longer necessary, but it served its purpose. It gave the world satellite navigation without giving adversaries precision weapon guidance during the most dangerous decade of the Cold War's end. The ICAO mandates that all commercial autopilots must include cross-check alerts and mode annunciations after 1985. The 747 mode selector gets a bright yellow INS disagree light in the next production block, illuminating whenever the autopilot is not following INS steering commands. The light does not prevent the crew from flying in HDG mode, but it ensures they know they are doing it. The silent error that doomed KAL-007 becomes impossible on every airliner certified after the mandate. KAL-007 becomes the last major commercial aviation disaster caused by pure INS navigation error. GPS cross-checks make silent course deviations of 300 miles impossible. Every airliner flying today compares inertial position to satellite position dozens of times per minute, and any disagreement triggers an immediate alert. The combination of GPS and mode selector annunciators closes both failure paths. The crew cannot unknowingly fly the wrong mode, and the navigation system cannot unknowingly calculate the wrong position. The tragedy killed 269 people and forced both superpowers to rethink the global navigation infrastructure. The U.S. opened a classified military satellite network to civilians worldwide, accepting the strategic risk in exchange for preventing another navigation disaster. The Soviets eventually acknowledged the error and changed Intercept procedures to require positive visual identification before weapons release. The shootdown did not end the Cold War, but it revealed the cost of keeping navigation technology classified when civilian aircraft share the same airspace as military interceptors. Selective availability was not a goodwill gesture. It was a calculated engineering compromise. It gave the world satellite navigation without giving adversaries precision weapon guidance, and it worked. For 17 years, civilian GPS was accurate enough to prevent another KAL-007, but not accurate enough to guide a cruise missile. When it was finally turned off in 2000, the strategic landscape had changed, and the compromise was no longer necessary. But the principle remains. Opening a military technology to civilians requires balancing safety, capability, and risk. The deadliest errors are the ones no instrument can see. KAL-007's crew had perfect instrument indications, flawless system operation, and no reason to doubt their navigation. The autopilot and INS were both working exactly as designed. They simply were not working together. The error was not mechanical. It was systemic. A gap in the interface between human intent and machine execution. Every safety improvement since 1983 has focused on closing that gap, on making sure the instruments can see what the crew cannot. Today, GPS is the global standard for aircraft navigation. Every airliner, every general aviation aircraft, every helicopter relies on satellite position fixes updated multiple times per second. The system CAL 007 did not have is now mandatory, universal, and free. It is the most successful technology transfer from military to civilian use in history. And it happened because a 747 flew 300 miles off course into Soviet airspace, and no instrument in the cockpit could tell the crew they were lost. The tragedy proved that navigation is not just a convenience, it is a matter of life and death. Before GPS, pilots relied on dead reckoning, radio beacons, and inertial systems that could drift miles off course with no warning. After GPS, every aircraft knows its position to within meters, every moment, everywhere on Earth. The revolution was not just technical, it was doctrinal. The world agreed that keeping navigation classified was more dangerous than sharing it, and that agreement has held for 40 years. The tragedy killed 269 people, forced the declassification of a global navigation system, and proved that the deadliest errors are the ones no instrument can see. It took a 747, 3 INS computers, 1 mode selector, and 5 hours over the Pacific to demonstrate that perfect instruments and flawless crews are not enough if the systems do not talk to each other. The lesson cost 269 lives. The solution, GPS, mode annunciators, and cross-check alerts, has saved thousands more. That is the legacy of Korean Airlines Flight 007.